Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2023 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Rethinking the Homeless Crisis, Black Spatial Visions for Los Angeles by Deshonay Dozier from 2022. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. I want to mention also that this piece is in the second out of 11 sections of the Homeless Industrial Complex playlist, Section 2 being called Organized Encampments Produce Communal Safety in the Face of Abandonment. The Homeless Industrial Complex reading package was put together by Annie Powers and Tracy Rosenthal, and you can download the entire thing for free at bit.ly/carceral housing. We'll put a link to that in the video description, also in a pinned comment. And we do have a playlist that we're working on where we're hoping to get all of these pieces put into that playlist here at Socialism for All. So back to Rethinking the Homeless Crisis, Black Spatial Visions for Los Angeles. This piece was first published in Antipode, a radical journal of geography. So we begin with the abstract. By thinking conjuncturally, this article urges urban geographers to rethink the site of encampments as a space for cultural intervention in urban planning and development. Drawing on content analysis of archival records, this article provides a case study of Black-led and supported encampment communities in the 1980s and 1990s in Los Angeles. These encampment communities emerged in a critical moment when Los Angeles became the homeless capital of the nation, while the demographics of the homeless became predominantly Black. The article shows the emergence of encampment communities as both a result of rising homelessness and as a necessity for creating life-fulfilling alternatives. As such, these include sonic critiques, cooperative planning, forming a commons, and a poetic ethnography against the carceral organization of homelessness. The article shows that to understand homelessness and crisis, geographers must take seriously the site of the encampment as an emerging cultural intervention. So we move on now to the article, which starts with a quote from Skid Row by Freddie Starr, Parliament Records, 1984. "Skid Row isn't a place where I'm supposed to be. I want to be in Beverly Hills, naturally. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a PhD, but I majored in hoboology. Skid Row, get me on. I hate living here with this cough. Skid Row, get me there. I'm tired of breathing this funky air. Just please get me off of my knees, come on." In 1984, Freddie Starr and an unnamed woman rapper, MC Jane Doe, released a single called Skid Row under Parliament Records. The genre of the song is electro-hop, which marked the early formations of hip-hop made by Black youth in Los Angeles. As the epigraph states, the emerging urban politics that made the West Side and Beverly Hills places to be has also deepened impoverishment in other parts of the city, as Black youth know all too well. In 1976, the city ordained a 50-block area to segregate the downtown poor from burgeoning redevelopment. Figure 1 is a map of how Skid Row became bordered within the landscape of downtown Los Angeles redevelopment. And there is Figure 1, map of downtown Los Angeles showing significant actors and sites of disruption and development in LA County related to the contestation detailed in this article. By 1984, Los Angeles had become the homeless capital of the United States, and by 1988, Black people made up 37% of Los Angeles' homeless population. Regional segregation could not be clearer. By the late 1990s, the historically Black and Latinx communities of South and East Los Angeles would become enjoined with Skid Row as a corridor of poverty. Hence, Freddie Starr and MC Jane Doe's critique that their experience of the city is undergirded by spatial confinement, or, "I know that I'm po, but I really didn't want to go to Skid Row." In this article, I trace the cultural and political critiques made by unhoused and poor Black Angelenos to put forth an alternative vision of Los Angeles. If, as Trisha Rose signaled, hip-hop is Black urban renewal, the profound critique embedded in the song Skid Row reveals the power of Black expressive culture as a site of imagination. In the refrain, Freddie Starr sings, Skid Row, get me on. Skid Row, get me there." Here, the artist suggests that while the neighborhood is a site of damnation, it may also be a place that could take him somewhere else altogether. This invites us as scholars to take a deeper look into the imaginative futures that are birthed out of Skid Row in the 1980s and 1990s. To what extent did Black, unhoused, and poor Angelenos Imagine alternative visions for Los Angeles. How did these practices reshape the city's discourse on homelessness? With the rise of encampments in 1980s Los Angeles, local discourse illuminated that strategies of containment and dispossession could not be a mainstay practice of governance. Urban geography has shown how urban movements produce ongoing critiques of punitive urban governance. While scholarly analysis has often engaged with how encampments can be short-lived or caught within a cycle of dispossession, we've paid little attention to the visions of the city that their denizens imagine. This article intervenes in urban geography by thinking conjuncturally about the crisis that encampments provoke to take seriously their sonic, poetic, and futuristic place-based imaginaries and practices of the city. In doing so, this article fills a gap in urban geography by revealing the emerging cultural politics of homelessness to provide a discussion of the homelessness crisis. Drawing on a blues epistemology as a methodology, I show how various encampment communities that formed in 1980s downtown Los Angeles sought to envision, plan, and practice a new way of being in the city. In 2009, Skid Row was deemed the most highly policed community in the United States. As such, Skid Row's historical and contemporary activism reveals the neighborhood as an epicenter of Los Angeles regional politics. It's critical to understand the cultural practices that have emerged from the area because it historically constitutes ongoing claims to reimagine Los Angeles, which has implications for how we study the cultural politics of urban movements. Rethinking Encampments, Conjuncture, and Emergence. In Mean Streets, Don Mitchell, in 2020, penned that we need new language for understanding the so-called homelessness crisis. The need for this new language results from how the rise of encampments, tent cities, and other spatial monikers of homelessness are often engulfed within a discourse of moral panic. As Peter Marcuse argued in 1988, this state-led moral discourse often neutralizes homelessness by creating a sense of urgency or crisis to solve homelessness, resulting in urban governance that contains or displaces the unhoused. This discourse and practice of panic in urban governance obfuscates the enduring political and economic shifts that create encampments. The discourse of homelessness itself is an important site, as Mitchell argued, for illuminating a contradiction in capitalist development. What are the contours of this contradiction, and what frameworks can allow us to provide a clearer picture of the so-called homelessness crisis? Stuart Hall argued that our analyses of crisis are significant insofar as we show how new alliances of dominance are forged, as well as how forms of counter-hegemonic resistance emerge. For example, in Policing the Crisis, Hall et al. In 2013 evaluated the moral panic around mugging in Britain to show how the so-called crisis revealed a cultural and structural shift that contributed to the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. Specifically, Hall et al. Demonstrated that the cultural ideas embedded in the panic around mugging had much to do with creating new categories of difference through the material implementation of criminalization. Evaluating discourses of panic provides insight into how harmful forms of human difference are culturally and structurally constructed toward hegemonic aims. However, Hall's larger body of work invites us to think conjuncturally as an analytical tool that details the contours of crisis to reveal how the politics of difference emerges and shifts towards hegemonic and counter-hegemonic ends over time. That is, as much as moments of crisis are constructed as a symptom of capitalism or through shifting hegemonic relations, grassroots movements or counter-hegemonic movements can also create moments of crisis to combat dominance. A conjunctural analysis is a useful framework for rethinking the homeless crisis with respect to frameworks of difference. Urban geography scholars have shown the politics of difference in homelessness studies in several ways. First, the literature has often presented an analysis of the homeless as an other within the urban landscape. In this sense, we see the politics of difference through various conjunctural shifts, such as the Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, post-war urbanism, and neoliberalism. The spatial contours of these moments of crisis are structured into carceral strategies such as poor camps, hospitalization, vagrancy laws and imprisonment, social service hubs or skid rows, and shelter warehousing. Recent analysis suggests that the growth and prevalence of encampments throughout the United States have resulted in partially state-sanctioned autonomous encampments or tent wards. This analysis has been extremely useful in understanding the structural elements of homelessness, bringing to light uneven access to public space and housing. In doing so, urban geography has analyzed the cultural ideologies that uphold the colonial and capitalist basis of property. Second, urban geography scholars have evaluated the varied ways people become homeless across racial, gendered, sexual identity, and class dynamics that details the politics of difference. The most notable study is Citizen Hobo, in which Todd DiPastino in 2003 evaluated various political and economic shifts to think through forms of cultural difference and their impact on people's experiences of homelessness. For example, DiPastino showed how, during the Industrial Revolution, when racial and gendered difference greatly defined who could become a vagrant, it was migrant laborers that made up the homeless population. Women migrants were exposed to sexual violence while looking for work, leading charitable organizations to create campaigns for housing and sheltering to combat this. Racial difference also influenced levels of autonomy and movement. European vagrants were criminalized through police precincts as state-led lodging, or had the ability to set up camps as a shelter, albeit meager and penal. Black vagrants could not easily set up encampments, nor move about the country to find work due to the rise of violence post-emancipation, resulting in their containment in the South and in community hubs in the North. DiPastino's thorough structural analysis of conjuncture and difference can provide more insight into how we understand the homeless crisis and the urban movements that emerge from them. While urban geography has worked to show how the crisis of homelessness has spatial, racial, gendered, and ability features that mark the politics of difference, there's a dearth of research on the counter-hegemonic mobilizations led by poor and unhoused people. As Tony Sparks argued in 2017, our examinations of homeless resistance have become too novel or vague. Most literature on encampments shows how they're a site of resiliency or coping to argue that we provide too little engagement with the span of unhoused resistance. To fill this gap, Sparks followed a Seattle-based encampment community and looked at how they combat displacement, revealing the contours of their success to gain particular rights over public space. Mitchell, in 2003, showed that structural shifts in homeless movements have created the need for a right-to-the-city framework to point to how the unhoused lay claim to increasingly privatized and carceral public space. The strategic fuzziness of rights allows us to pay attention to how people negotiate the structural and legal conditions of property that underpin public space. Nick Blomley, in 2003, posited that seeing property as unsettled or impermanent can expand our understanding of the tools people employ to reshape their sense of place. However, as Kafui in 2011 powerfully penned, there are real limits to the type of rights urban movements gain, showing the inherent contradictions of liberalism. Atto's analysis has created a call to think more robustly about urban movements. I argued that by thinking conjuncturally, we will gain greater depth of understanding of the cultural and structural elements of the rise of homelessness, which have implications for how we analyze appeals for a right to the city. Here, I am particularly keen on a Hallian analysis of emergent culture as, quote, the process of making new definitions and new ways of experiencing social life, unquote. Therefore, it's important to show the cultural differences in categories of homelessness to reveal the structural and cultural resistance that emerges from movements led by the unhoused. This allows for a more robust language for engaging in the contradictions of homelessness and crisis. Comment here. So basically what they're saying is that homelessness is not a monolith, and that people from different backgrounds or different socially recognized demographics are going to have different experiences in terms of how they become homeless, how they cope with homelessness, and what their options are for living in that status. Recalling other readings that we've done on this channel, there is an early one from Mao Zedong in the 1920s where he breaks down different types of peasants, basically into 5 levels of, you have the very poor peasants all the way up to the rich peasants and landlords. So in other words, just as the peasantry was not a monolith, neither is the homeless population. And so that's what this article is getting into. Continuing. Jordan Camp provides insight into how we might shift our discussion of the homeless crisis by providing a conjunctural analysis in his study of contemporary conditions of unhoused Angelenos containment in Skid Row. For example, Camp detailed a community organizing event led by the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LACAN, a prominent grassroots organization, and Public Enemy, the infamous hip-hop group. Describing this event as an extension of a sonic and political tradition of critique, Camp showed that the sonic claims to shut him down from Public Enemy to the presentation of human rights violations in Geneva by LACAN reveals an emergent cultural politics that connect to the enduring state abandonment and banishment of Black Angelenos. Camp's study adds to the right to the city discussion by attending to contemporary resistance, yet we have not traced the historical conjuncture of emerging cultural traditions among the unhoused. This article details how the rise of encampments in 1980s Los Angeles made way for an emergent cultural politics to reimagine the city. To do so, I draw on Clyde Wood's notion of blues epistemology, an African-American tradition of critiquing dominant development and putting forth the material visions to overwrite them. Blues epistemology can be a useful methodological framework for seeing the emergent cultural politics of homelessness. For example, Woods theorized that Black working-class populations imagined space through critiques of dominance and varied visions and practices of other ways of being. Woods traced this tradition through various conjunctural shifts within the regional geography of the South to show how shifting relations of difference form spatial processes of dominance and resistance. Using blues epistemology as a method of research can be a critical tool for the field of urban geography to do several important things. 1. Track the traditions of resistance that emerge from working-class populations in different regions. 2. Show how these traditions of resistance operate in antagonism with dominant development. 3. Engage with how these traditions get incorporated or foreclosed by dominant development. And 4. Offer an analytical method to show the political openings these traditions lay bare. Engaging with these elements of blues epistemology as a qualitative methodological and analytical tool, this article uses mixed qualitative methods of oral history, archival research, and narrative analysis to weave a story of the emergent cultural practices of homeless encampments. Specifically, I lean on archival materials such as policy reports, correspondence between activists and politicians, newspapers, grassroots planning documents, documentaries, music, and poetry. In addition, I lean on oral histories conducted by the Los Angeles Poverty Department, a Skid Row performance group and museum, on the history of the neighborhood. I focus specifically on the conjunctural shift in the politics of homelessness in the 1980s and 1990s. Specifically, this shift marked new modes of difference, where homelessness became largely young and Black. I engage with the cultural practices of homeless encampments that formed as Black spatial visions of Los Angeles. Throughout my findings, I trace 3 prominent encampment communities, Justiceville, and commenting the last entry in the Homeless Industrial Complex playlist is a video documentary about Justiceville by the title Justiceville, continuing, Another Planet, and the Homeless Writers Coalition. In what follows, I provide 3 scenes of emergence. Emergence 1, Reshaping Life Out of Balance and the Plantation Rat Race, shows the critiques of encampment communities as they are formed against state-led containment and dispossession. Emergence 2, A Commons and a Cooperative, reveals the everyday practices by encampment communities that go into planning for a new Los Angeles through a vision of a commons and a cooperative. Comment there, somebody was asking at the end, spoiler alert if you haven't read it already, at the end of the last reading, Infrastructures of Community, it's detailed how, after being left alone for a fairly long time due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the encampment community at Echo Lake Park built up a pretty well-developed commons. They had a kitchen, they had showers, all of these things. And then at the end, the police came in with a militarized raid, crushed everything, threw it away, etc. The commenter asked, why do the police brutalize these communities so much? Is it just to get them to take jobs, etc.? And the reality is no. 40 to 50% of homeless people in the United States have jobs. They have some kind of employment. It's not really about that. I think that especially what they don't want is for compelling alternative visions of a commons to emerge that does not coincide with their ideals of how private and public property are used within capitalism. If they're used in ways which could undermine the foundations of that system and get people interested in something other than what the status quo is in a way that really challenges the foundations of the status quo. That's what they're really trying to prevent from emerging. And I think that this idea in Emergence 2, a new Los Angeles, a vision of a commons and a cooperative, that's the kind of thing that really they need to suppress, because that is a vision that could, actually rally people. Anyway, continuing. Emergence 3, Discord, Incorporation, and Possibility, describes the political openings these encampment communities made possible, while showing how they get incorporated or foreclosed in urban space through social services and spatial restructuring. Emergence 1, Reshaping Life Out of Balance and the Plantation Rat Race. In 1985, 73 people occupied a private vacant lot in Skid Row and called it Justiceville. Justiceville was a large, black-lead encampment community that created shelter from scraps of metal, wood, tires, and steel bins. The encampment included a central square where dwellers regularly cooked meals, communed together, and held meetings to solve intracommunal conflict. Justiceville received backlash from nonprofit organizations in support of the formation of Skid Row, as well as politicians and local businesses who claimed public health violations. As a result, the city cited Justiceville as an illegal settlement that violated dozens of health and safety regulations. Of course, just living on the sidewalk as solitary individuals, much healthier, safer, sure. However, local press coverage led to a following and support from unlikely allies. Ernest Dozier, owner of the American Fish Company and the vacant lot, supported Justiceville, allowing them to rent the lot for $1 a month in response to impending eviction, and a private company donated portable toilets to reduce health and safety violations. These efforts, however, were not enough to stop eviction pressures, and Dozier finally caved to public officials who urged him to evict. Justiceville arranged the date of eviction with Dozier so that they could broadcast the political moment when officers met protesters with a notice to vacate. The ensuing skirmish resulted in the arrest of 12 Justiceville members. Justiceville had shifted commonly held notions of homelessness in the region through news media, major production movies, television shows, and documentaries. The most revealing was Gary Glazer's Justiceville, 1986, which was broadcast by PBS. The documentary recorded the closure of the encampment in real time. Electro-hop artist Tom Beefbone Belima partnered with the director to produce and write the theme song, Justiceville. Another version of the song was later performed by Holly Watts, the rap moniker of award-winning black actor Roger G. Smith, known for his role in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Later, the infamous rapper Ice-T performed and recorded a version of the theme song. The sonic and visual media interventions of the Justiceville encampment showed that unhoused people can intervene through a vision for space. This intervention revealed Justiceville as an intentional community. Academic scholarship has not examined the local cultural landscape from which the encampment emerged. Instead, the scholarship has noted it as a site of survival and critique of regional neglect. The literature also revealed it as a site that challenged ownership over the built environment by retooling property and urban land use through squatting as a means of collective determination over the urban landscape. Justiceville, however, sought to live out its namesake through reshaping Los Angeles' built environment. Many other sites of communities emerged in Skid Row with the goal of reshaping Los Angeles. In 1988, a community called Another Planet, quote, emerges Phoenix-like out of the sooty recesses of downtown Skid Row. Clyde Casey, a white artist known as the Avant Guardian, moved to Los Angeles in the early 1980s and was hired as a security guard for the Wallen Boyd Theater. However, Casey used unusual means to guard the building. With second-hand instruments and instruments self-made from scrap metal, Casey employed sound to detract unwanted uses of the theater. Paying $200 a month, Casey rented an empty gas station that was formerly used as a parking lot for the theater and called it Another Planet. It became a place where unhoused people in Skid Row could store their belongings, eat, sanitize, and engage in arts and experimentation. Another Planet's daily activities included poetry readings, musical jam sessions, film screenings, sleeping, eating, sculpting, painting, writing, and playing games such as dominoes. As Casey stated, quote, the missions feed the stomachs and the spiritual nature somewhat, but when it comes to feeding the mind, the missions don't, and that's basically what this energy is all about, feeding the imagination, unquote. Another planet was also called a homeless cultural center, countering the existing culture of care that could be found through the development of the neighborhood as a social service hub. Both Justiceville and Another Planet were sites of imagination born from a critique of urban development. For Another Planet, what most symbolizes their critique was the centering of experimentation as an avant-garde aesthetic practice. For example, the site implemented routine screenings of Koyaanisqatsi, the 1982 countercultural film, which, in the indigenous Hopi language, means a state of life that calls for another way of living. The film played at sunrise and sunset. As Casey stated, quote, "I wanted to show that tape because it depicts life out of balance as it is, and I want this energy to be separate from that, a balance somewhere," unquote. The film is understood as experimentalist or avant-garde because it features both slow and fast-moving images of urban and natural landscapes, accompanied by a soundtrack composed by Philip Glass, most known for his minimalist and repetitive compositions. There are no words aside from the film title and the use of arias within the composition. Comment: I recommend this movie, by the way, if you haven't seen it before. It's worth a watch. They eventually made 2 sequels to it. I think, from what I recall, the third one was maybe not quite on the same level, but definitely check out at least the first one. Continuing. Routine viewings of Koyaanisqatsi symbolized a critique of U.S. urban development as out of balance, and connected this to the Los Angeles region's highway development and to the demolition of the Missouri housing project, Pruitt-Ego. As such, Another Planet's aphorism, "The best way to get ahead is to have one," became a particular ethics and ethos to create a space of critique where an imagination for place as a futuristic endeavor can put uneven development into balance. This balance featured most prominently in the creation of a commons where mind expansion, experimentation, and imagination could thrive. Justiceville's critiques were also based in creating and envisioning a futuristic Los Angeles. In an important scene in Glazer's Justiceville, the director pans the camera out to show Ted Hayes, a well-known advocate for the homeless, and an unknown Justiceville member, walking up the stairs of a city building toward an office space donated by San Fernando Valley District 7 Councilman Hernani Bernardi. In their office, the activists reveal a 3D model of a geodesic dome, the main feature of their master plan to combat systemic urban violence through an Afrofuturist vision of solving homelessness. Justiceville sent this plan to any public official they could talk to. In their master plan, Justiceville argued that homeless people are outsiders of society. As such, the homeless are often encapsulated into a cycle syndrome, an urban social service model of cycling people from the shelter bed to the streets and back again. Figure 2 shows how the cycle syndrome purportedly rehabilitates people back into mainstream society. However, Justiceville argued that this mainstream society is a plantation rat race. And there's a visual of Figure 2, the cycle syndrome, which details how services often put people back into a mainstream society that will lead them back into a carceral system. It looks a bit abstract at first glance. If you read the key down at the bottom, though, you see that homeless persons are the gray shaded area. G stands for government programs. TH stands for transient housing. P stands for private programs. V stands for vouchers. H stands for a hotel or SRO. SRO standing for single room occupancy, commonly known as like a flop house. If you've seen the movie Big, the place where Tom Hanks stays when he's in the city and not making much money, a lot of these got demolished during gentrification in the early neoliberal period and no longer exist. S stands for shelters, MI stands for missions, and O stands for outsiders. Back to the text. If Catherine McKittrick in 2013 analyzed the plantation as a form of urban development in and of itself, Justiceville critiqued Los Angeles as a site of urban violence that could be seen as persistent human environment neglect. As such, they proposed an alternate exit from the cycle syndrome, and thus the plantation rat race, with their master plan for a cooperative Los Angeles. Emergence 2, a commons and a cooperative. Another Planet fostered what Peter Linebaugh describes as the commoning of everyday life on Skid Row. Another Planet sought to rework the structural prescriptions of life that were imposed onto denizens. As 23-year-old songwriter Parrish Nelson states, quote, "I came here and had a couple of existential conversations. Spent the whole night talking. This place fits me, the spontaneity. There's equality here. with no real authority figure in the conversations. It's open-minded. How frequently does that happen anyplace else? Maybe on the road or in some good classrooms, but it doesn't happen often in normal life, unquote. Not only did Another Planet evade, quote, normal life, it became a respite from mainstream rehabilitation, the social service industry, and everyday subsistence. As Midnight Mission's operations manager, Kenneth Lewing, stated, quote, quite a few people from the mission go over there and play games, sing, watch TV. As far as I'm concerned, it seems like a good thing. They're happy there, unquote. Much like Justiceville's critique of the cycle syndrome, Another Planet attempted to evade the carcerality found in the institutions that made Skid Row. Forms of play and creativity were central to everyday life at Another Planet. Dominoes, chessboards, checkers, and darts featured as mechanisms of mind expansion. These games were a practice of publics, a deep engagement with fellow homeless neighbors that bridged community through wit and play. Games were paired with jam sessions and poetry readings. See Figure 3. Pictured here, it's a performance occurring in front of Another Planet at the corner of Wall and Boyd in downtown LA. Picture courtesy of the Los Angeles Poverty Department. According to Nelson, quote, people come over and wild and zany things occur. Two-way jam sessions on instruments we've created and that kind of thing, unquote. Another Planet became a place where unhoused people could initiate other forms of cultural production. Regular street poets of Another Planet banded together to create a poetry collective called the Homeless Writers Coalition, or HWC, and produced various anthologies and a poetry record about their everyday life on Skid Row. The founders were Southern Comfort, Dino, Alexander, and Russ, black residents of Skid Row who lived in SROs, residential hotels, and on the streets. Their anthologies included poetry, letters to family, the neighborhood, the president, and administrators, and letters to the editor, essays on social services that serve as political ethnography, skits, short stories, and event advertisements. Anthologies also included reprints of writing and entries from homeless activists throughout the nation, including the infamous Jack Hirschman of the National Union of the Homeless in New York, and others writing from Philadelphia, Massachusetts, and San Francisco. In addition, the HWC hosted meetups and poetry readings, and put on theatrical performances of member-produced plays at Another Planet and throughout downtown. The HWC began as a coalition of mostly black homeless men, but grew to include a mix of black and non-black women, both housed and unhoused. HWC believed that their collective determination for creativity and artistry was a vital element of proposed solutions to homelessness. What is perhaps most reflective of this determination is the editor's note of the first anthology, The Word, the Voice of an American Third World Community, by Mundane Writers. Their creative production is sustained by the belief that if, quote, the voice of an American Third World Community was left unheard, harmful discourses about the homeless and poor would continue. Exodus Genesis Initiative Plan, the vision for a cooperative Los Angeles. If Another Planet had created a vision and practice of a commons, Justiceville created a vision for a citywide cooperative. Specifically, Justiceville envisioned the Exodus Genesis Initiative Plan, Egypt, a plan to remedy the plantation rat race and urban violence that produced homelessness. The title, a play on the word Egypt, signified the possibility of houseless people building an alternative Afrocentric form of development. To make Egypt a reality within Los Angeles, Justiceville imagined various transitional land communities, riffing off of the acronym Tender Love and Care, that would A. create villages through the futuristic architecture of Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes as housing, B. develop an aqua and agricultural farm maintained by dome inhabitants to feed residents, and C. reshape urban land politics by creating nestled village clusters to combat NIMBYism. Figure 4 details the process in which the transitional land communities, or TLCs, could form in Los Angeles. And there you see Figure 4, the Egypt Exodus Genesis Initiative Plan, a master plan to solve hardcore or outsider homelessness, a Justiceville document, copyright Ted Hayes, 1989. Phase 1, TLC, Transitional Land Community, and that's coming from the existing homeless community, which is the embryonic phase, hardcore or outsider homelessness. So that transitions through the urban centers into that Phase 1 TLC, Transitional Land Community, which they consider a launch pad or staging area, which then turns into Phase 2, Cluster TLC, designed to cure NIMBYism. And there you can see multiple TLCs in network with each other, and then that transitions to Phase 3, Planned City, a national and global model. Back to the main text. Justiceville's practice sat within a Black reimagining of the urban. Black poet and writer June Jordan worked with Buckminster Fuller in the 1960s and envisioned an environmentally sustainable master plan that included cone-like high-rises that would save 1 million Black Harlemites. Working within this futurist tradition to reimagine the urban through architecture and planning, Justiceville extended a vision of sustainable development through food and domes that interrupted the carceral development of Los Angeles and centered Black people in a new urban future. In 1987, to make way for Pope John Paul II's visit to Los Angeles, a massive sweep of encampments and Skid Row denizens took place, and residents were moved to an urban campground popularly known as the Dust Bowl Hilton. The campground was promoted as a partnership between intentional encampments, not-for-profit philanthropic organizations, and city officials. Within a 2-week time span, the infrastructure of an encampment that could serve 600 people, with toilets, showers, canopies, clothes, food, and cots, was developed just east of Union Station. Most of the 200 people registered by the 3rd day of the campground were from intentional encampments like Love Camp and Justiceville. Each of the encampments agreed that they would actively participate in the governance of the campground, but this ended when the Salvation Army took on the managerial role. Encampment activists saw the campground as an opportunity for not-for-profits to get in on the act, as encampments facilitated a narrative shift, focusing on self-determination and alternative development, rather than the cycle syndrome in Skid Row. While the campground was a resource hub that housed 70 women and children, ultimately the site was only temporary. The city's campground lasted for 8 months, and even that was only because the encampment groups protested to keep it open longer. After the campground closure, Justiceville inhabitants conducted a 2-month-long march throughout the West Side corridor of LA that they called the Trek for Justice. Trekkies marched down the affluent West Side corridor to the niche communities of Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, Malibu, Pacific Palisades, and Venice. Their march sought to learn how affluent communities were able to sustain themselves. However, by trekking through the West Side, Justiceville reworked Skid Row as a carceral geography that helped shore up West Side affluence, calling attention to houselessness within their public spaces. This helped to reveal regional segregation. During the trek, Santa Monica was the most apprehensive, with the police evicting their occupation within a day, while in Beverly Hills, Justiceville was greeted by the police with coffee and donuts. In the Mid-Wilshire area, Trekkies were redirected from certain properties within the district by real estate investor David Adams, the same investor who later financially backed Egypt. In Venice, Justiceville camped out for the longest duration of any site. This was possible because Venice is well known within the region for having a large presence of resistance to homelessness and houselessness. When a storm blew away the Trek for Justice encampment, Venice resident and celebrity Yoko Ono donated money to help Justiceville resurrect their encampment. The Trek for Justice was not an isolated event in gaining support from regional elites. Early on, Justiceville leader Ted Hayes developed a relationship with ARCO, the Los Angeles-based oil company and elite landowner and developer. The alliances forged through Another Planet, Homeless Writers Coalition, and Justiceville were crucial for their long-range possibilities. Emergence 3. Discord, Incorporation, and Possibility. Discord at the Domes. In 1993, Justiceville's Dome Village opened on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles. ARCO donated $250,000, and permits were passed to get it up and running within a month. It would serve as the first iteration of Justiceville's Egypt, with 20 $6,500 fiberglass domes, each of them 20 feet wide. Inhabitants had bathrooms and showers, kitchens and laundry rooms, and communal office space. Dwelling spaces included a closet and were furnished with donated beds, dressers, and chairs. The village included streets such as Justice Way, and had a central area with a small patch of grass with flower beds and trees called Little Arco Plaza, named after the Arco Plaza erected in Central City in 1972. One prominent feature of the village was a pint-sized dome for the village dog, Coco. On opening day, inhabitants wore white jumpsuits, symbolizing new beginnings and the village as a transitional phase on the road to Egypt. The 24 inhabitants, 18 men and 6 women who occupied Dome Village on opening day, were mostly from Justiceville's prior encampments. According to David Adams, the investor who saw the utility of building domes rather than apartments for houseless people, because apartments were, quote, too expensive, Dome Village was thought of as a cost-effective approach to housing the homeless. Wide acceptance of the domes among downtown elites was clear, as Carton Norris, community affairs manager of ARCO, stated, quote, anytime you want change, you have to begin with something unusual. This is an experiment, unquote. While elites saw it as a success, others saw it as a first, not a final, step. As scholar Jennifer Walsh explained to journalists at the time, quote, the danger would be if the public or politicians see this as a cheap solution to housing, unquote, which clearly David Adams did think so. You know, some people can live in apartments and other people just sort of live in domes and everything's fine and the people in domes will never, want anything more. There'll never be a rift, etc. No, these domes were seen as part of a plan for a new society, a reshaping, a new way to live. While the creation of Dome Village was primarily supported by private funding, state funding helped in times of crisis. Justiceville's rent at the time of its opening was $2,500 a month. County Supervisor Yvonne Braithwaite Burke and Councilwoman Rita Walters allocated public funds of nearly $22,500, helping to pay the rent and other expenses in the first year. Without adequate funding streams, monetary needs weighed on members. Residential life included the regular maintenance of the village, including the cleaning up of the surrounding area and the 18 dome structures. In addition, residents chipped in $50 a month from their cash assistance or food stamps to contribute food and other expenses for the village. Discord at the domes revealed that the politics of this blues vision faltered around its leadership. Residential life presented difficulties, with various interpersonal issues associated with creating community and leadership. Almost all original Justiceville members had left or were told to leave in the first months of Dome Village, and nearly 50 people had cycled through the program in the first year. This high turnover was in part linked to Ted Hayes' leadership. In a thorough spread about Ted Hayes, Los Angeles Times reporter Kathleen Decker in 1987 describes him as the face of Los Angeles' homeless issue. Hayes', quote, golden oratory mobilized a wide audience and following. However, many were ambivalent, if not antagonistic, to Hayes' leadership. His ability to have a following of homeless people received mixed reception among nonprofit agencies and Black Angelenos. The People of Color Homeless Coalition were particularly cautious, suggesting that the domes felt reminiscent of Jim Jones' Jonestown. This concern should not be understated when considering the conditions of Black Los Angeles. With a plan to build a better life in Jonestown, Guyana, Jim Jones' cult saw nearly 900 Black Angelenos migrate and subsequently die from a chemical-treated drink. Comment, this is where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid as a derogatory, like you're swallowing cult propaganda, comes from. Continuing. Hayes was not asking people to drink the Kool-Aid, however, and his cult of personality and interest in garnering futurist visions ensured elites, activists, and poor people alike considered Hayes a leader in combating homelessness. Hayes also engaged in political pandering. He ran as an independent and lost his bid for the mayoral race, and then became a Republican shortly after, developing a rapport with his former opponent, Mayor Richard Riordan. Hayes justifies the turnover, stating, quote, what we were dealing with was straight-up Wild Bunch people. Now it has changed somewhat. It still may take some pushing to keep these people on their toes, but they're on a better track, unquote. Those who stayed felt that Dome Village should be approached with an attitude of patience. As Dome Village resident Jerry Eisen stated, quote, it takes patience. People expected everything to work as smoothly as it was to build these domes, but we're not dealing with materials here, we're dealing with people. And all people have their own problems. We went through some of the hardest times. I hope, this village will see. So the only place to go now is forward, unquote. Dome Village lasted for 12 years, marking the end of a 20-year odyssey led by Ted Hayes. In 2006, Hayes' republicanism and newfound anti-immigrant rhetoric led the liberal leaser of the parking lot the dome sat on to evict the village. Talk about the limitations of liberalism and taking it out on the wrong person. Yet, rising property values in the downtown was more than enough reason for the leaser to make use of the land. Simply put, without control over relations of property, such as ownership of or long-term access to urban land, Justiceville could not get far on the road to Egypt. As Herring noted, the Justiceville encampment ultimately became the transitional housing program and self-sustained cooperative they imagined. Nonetheless, plans to expand the domes to sites such as Inglewood came up against NIMBYism, halting the expansion of Egypt completely. While Justiceville inevitably produced a vision for alternative development, they were restrained by the regional landscape of property and the social services that created Skid Row and marked the structural conditions of their spatial planning. So comment, in other words, this was yet another utopian cooperative vision which was not able to survive and thrive under capitalism. This kind of thing, look at Lenin's On Cooperation, I believe it's 1922 or 23. That describes how what Lenin describes as the old cranks, the cooperators, promoters of the cooperative movement, who touted cooperatives as a transitional path to socialism out from under capitalism, were completely wrong about being able to use cooperatives as a transitional measure. But after the socialist revolution and the nationalization of the land, then cooperatives could actually fulfill more of their promise. In short, capitalist society and the people really interested in maintaining capitalist property relations are not going to really tolerate anything that seriously threatens their system or provides an alternative vision for long. Such efforts must be organized as part of a large-scale, nationwide class struggle, and then as that movement reaches its climax, power must be seized before the conservative reaction can mobilize itself and sweep it all away. Otherwise, you have two options: be extremely marginal or integrate yourself into the existing system, which is just going to end up reproducing the same set of conditions, property relations, etc., that are found in the rest of the system that gave rise to whatever social problem it is, in this case homelessness, in the first place. Like a rising phoenix, social services and the structuring of everyday life. The experiment that was Another Planet ended when it burned to the ground. Clyde Casey had left Los Angeles to hitchhike his way to visit his mother. He left Another Planet under the guardianship of Barbara Frost, a missionary who lived on the streets of Skid Row. When Casey arrived, Another Planet had been stripped of its character. The art and the unconventional structures were removed. Shortly later, an unhoused resident set the site on fire. Most Another Planet members lost valuable belongings, including poetry, plays, and pictures. While Another Planet's nearly year-long existence ended, its larger visions lived on. Specifically, Casey imagined that they could embed a version of Another Planet every 12 blocks in the city of LA, allowing neighbors in various communities to get together and create an alternative space that would run 24/7. Another plan included developing a city-sized version of Another Planet outside Los Angeles. Clyde Casey and a business partner visited Amboy, California, a ghost town in the desert that would cost, quote, only $1 million to transform into a 24/7 Burning Man, a temporary annual community and art city in the Nevada desert. Casey saw Burning Man as an inspiration for a permanent experimental city with a focus on arts. While these larger visions did not manifest, Another Planet was seeking a way out of conventional city life and public space. Ultimately, Another Planet's vision for a communication center was best found through the anthologies of the Homeless Writers Coalition. After Another Planet, there was limited institutional support for creative and artistic practices on the row. Working with Wallen Boyd theater owner Scott Kelman, Barbara Frost and the HWC sought to recreate Another Planet by hosting regular poetry and jamming sessions called Visions at San Julian Park in Skid Row. However, the funding and institutional support faltered. Though HWC was applauded for their cultural production by Skid Row institutions, they found this attention patronizing. Silver Ghost, Robert Chambers' editorial in the Homeless Writers Forum, describes the difficulty of getting the anthology to readers after they encountered roadblocks to accessing computers and printing at major shelters and missions. The lack of investment in cultural production among these so-called rehabilitative institutions included limited investment in the potential of poetry and fiction to change people's lives. In Whose Life Anyway?, Chambers describes how the homeless artist's ability to create shapes their reality. He goes on to state that every time a houseless person loses their belongings, quote, we lose a little of our culture, a little of our humanity, unquote. For the HWC, which was positioned within the grassroots activism of downtown LA, their visions of life were more than domes, gesturing to the creative commons emerging in Skid Row that turned a critical eye on the political imagination of spaces like Another Planet. One of Robert Chambers' editorials in Homeless Writers Forum in 1996 opens the anthology with a photocopy of a note from Bobby, an unhoused woman who died from AIDS. Bobby's note to Chambers is about continuing in creative production. Bobby herself lost 2 novels she had written in her time on the street due to the disposal of her belongings. At times, losing valuables was debilitating. Chambers had not been able to write himself after losing his belongings when a residential hotel temporarily evicted him. Using the blank pages of the legal pad that contained Bobby's message and the spirit of hope she left in her note, Chambers wrote a play, which was produced by the Ebony Showcase Theater in downtown LA. In 1998, the city's redevelopment agency used eminent domain to close and demolish the Ebony Showcase Theater. Widening bureaucracy and the penal system of homeless services and urban planning limited Black unhoused spaces of creative production, making the vision of a cultural center ever more prescient. This was crystallized after a legal suit prompted the city and county to better coordinate around homeless services. This cohesion led to the formation of a county-wide agency called the Los Angeles Homeless Services Agency, LAHSA. Federal, state, county, and city funding and programs aimed at ending homelessness would be funneled through one agency. The political ethnography of the Homeless Writers Coalition assessed it as another bureaucratic structure that functioned as, quote, people telling other people what to do, unquote. In his essay, Slow Development at LAHSA, Robert Chambers provides an ethnographic account of disappointment with the agency. Quote, everyone at the meeting seemed in a semi-state of shock. Those that could stormed out in anger and tried to put on brave faces. LAHSA meetings are always emotionally charged gatherings. After all, the stakes are high, much higher than I think most board members realize. Those that have been homeless realize the urgency, people dying on the streets from hypothermia, emotional deprivation, and crime. We want changes now, unquote. I just want to add, I think that emotional deprivation part is huge, and I hope that we revisit that topic in future readings. In HWC's view, the formation of LAHSA revealed that bureaucratic structures would not amplify unhoused people's concerns and voices. For example, when LAHSA initially rejected homeless representation on its board, public and community backlash resulted in a prominent homeless activist being elected to the LAHSA board. However, minimal input from the homeless and community leaders at LAHSA meetings revealed that the restructuring limited the scope of real solutions to homelessness through an already jeopardized bureaucratic agency. Like Bobby's note, the pages of the HWC's anthologies were the only space that unhoused Black people could express their discontent while also imagining a better way of life outside of the confines of Skid Row. Toward a better Los Angeles. The importance of these place-based cultural interventions in Los Angeles' newfound homelessness crisis cannot be understated. The, quote, new, predominantly Black homeless community in 1980s Los Angeles worked to intervene in the politics of difference that shaped their uneven experience of houselessness, ushering in spatial visions for the city. This article engaged the emergent sonic and spatial critiques that could transform the city and its politics, providing a more thorough engagement with the cultural interventions made by unhoused and poor people in the homelessness crisis, and thereby challenging cultural and structural differences in space. For Justiceville, their vision was a cooperative. For Another Planet and the Homeless Writers Coalition, their vision was a commons. As these groups emerged, they created an everyday spatial practice to combat the punitive elements of urban planning and social welfare. Ultimately, their aim to shift the rising homeless crisis led to the limits of their interventions in the urban fabric. For Justiceville, their work with politicians and the business sector led to their sustained incorporation as a social service agency. This incorporation, however, limited the greater vision of the organization, while also revealing the limitations of intervening in the property ethic of the city. Another Planet's and the HWC's practices and visions of commoning space could not be incorporated into the urban fabric. These are common conclusions in urban geography. We show how grassroots interventions are not sustained in the finite material sense. The point of this article, however, is to understand how emergent cultural practices enfold scalar interventions in moments of crisis through the conjunctural shifts they initiate or respond to. By using blues epistemology as a method, I have gauged the cultural critiques from Black unhoused people and their supporters. The encampment communities that emerged intervened in the cultural politics of homelessness by challenging the carceral manifestations of homeless management through visions and plans for the city. As such, this article engaged with a local tradition of resistance that continues to influence Los Angeles regional politics. Today, Skid Row concentrates 40% of the city's single-room occupancy housing and is the epicenter of grassroots resistance in the region. The historical context of the formation of Skid Row and its activist past has provided many signposts for what is to come and what can be done. Grassroots organizations that have emerged in Skid Row over the last 20 years continue within this tradition. For example, the Los Angeles Poverty Department, a performance group, and Skid Row Museum and Archive, has been preserving the neighborhood's history of activism since the 1980s. The organization has performed a variety of resident-based theater and created art-based installations about urban redevelopment, the rising carceral state, and houselessness. In addition, the Los Angeles Community Action Network has fought to significantly reduce policing in Skid Row and is now urging the city to produce eco-hoods, ecological, sustainable housing developments indirectly related to some of the visions of Justiceville, that can provide the unhoused with a more viable housing solution. This comes in the wake of the Unhoused Tenants Against Carceral Housing's fight against the continued carceral housing solutions in the city. Skid Row and the political visions that emerge from it serve as an important site of regional politics, showing a sustained tradition for a better Los Angeles. So that's the end of the article. We conclude with an endnote here relating to Justiceville and the ways that it's been portrayed in media. And there's a reference to the John Carpenter movie They Live. Filmed in downtown Los Angeles, it's a countercultural film critiquing elite urbanism, featuring Justiceville as a contradiction to capitalist urban development in a changing 1980s urban landscape. Highly recommend that one as well. If you haven't seen it before, you'll recognize some of the images out of that have become sort of iconic and memes and things like that. Justiceville members were also featured in several other documentary films, including the Academy Award-winning Down and Out in America by Lee Grant, Open Air Asylum by Phil Reeder, and Trouble in Paradise by Gary Glazer. These documentaries aimed to shine a light on the problems of systemic poverty, economic recession, and planned neglect. In addition, Justiceville inhabitants were paid actors on the last episode of the Black sitcom 227, called No Place Like Home, which focused on the spiritual elements and struggle of making a home.